Thank you very much, Susan. So I'm just going to do a slight preamble on the second issue, the second case study that you're going to hear about today. So let me take you through that. So the particular topic is a license exception that we have in our Act today, and we refer to it as a repeal of Section 12.3 of our Act. And essentially what it says is that if you are practicing professional engineering as an employee for your employer on equipment and machinery that's being used within your facilities of your employer, and you're making a product for your employer, if you meet all those three things, then as the law says today, you don't need a license, and that is being repealed currently. This is something that we do only in Ontario, this regulatory framework, and it primarily will have an impact on the manufacturing sector as the major area. But let me take you a little bit, give you a bit of background on the timeline of how all this came about. So essentially, before 1984, there was no such thing. So if you did this kind of engineering work in Ontario, you needed a license. In 1984, the Engineers Act changed, and it exempted this kind of work from license going forward. From a policy perspective, it's very unclear what the policy framework was to come to that type of decision. Then it takes us into the 90s. So from the 84 to the 90s, basically the government had a process to sort of capture this engineering work anyways under review. And so in a way, this kind of work was having some sort of oversight. But then in the late 90s, the decision was not to do that anymore and to put the onus onto the private sector. And so when that happened, basically from the late 90s up until now, this area of engineering work doesn't have oversight. So that takes us to 2010. So 2010 was the year when the Ontario government passed a piece of legislation called Bill 68, Open for Business Act, and in that bill, they removed this exception, repealed the exception. So essentially, this kind of engineering work now would require a license. In so doing on the timeline, you'll see in my next slides, the date of when to do that. So this is a royal assent date is 2010, but not necessarily the date of implementation. So there was some talk already in the session today about complexity and interdependence of issues, and I think there's many in this particular example where there was some issues initially that were being looked at, problems to solve, and then the realization that there's actually more complexity and more interdependence of other kinds of issues. So what are they? Certainly around consultation, in consulting on such a change, there's multiple ministries in government, for example, that would play a role in this kind of a change. So that's one piece of it. Obviously, within those practicing, so there's the profession around the practicing of this work. But then there's also the people that are affected within an industry sector. And so who do you consult with on such a broad industry sector? Who are the right people to bring to the table? And you know, there's not one group out there that represents all 6,000 manufacturers in Ontario, for example. So where do you go to make sure that all those voices come forward in consultation? So that was certainly one area of complexity. Another area of complexity is looking at what are the statistics out there about what happens within this sector as related to this kind of work not having public accountable oversight today. And it brings us to the fact that we have injury and fatality statistics in the manufacturing sector in Ontario that are above any other sector in Ontario, which says, okay, here's something that we need to do about, and I'm sure there's many ways of addressing it, and this is one piece of it, so there's complexity in that. There was some talk this morning around social well-being, and that comes into play in this particular example because when we look about workers working and workers not working, there's a lot of studies about what does it mean in terms of societal well-being. So when people are not working and they're at home, when they're using the healthcare system, when they're not spending their money as they normally would, when they maybe don't go back to work, they have to retrain. So there's a broader sort of social well-being complexity that comes into the policies of this particular change. And then the other one is around mobility. So in the introduction of the topic, I explained that this is an Ontario-only situation. And so from a national perspective, from an access of business across Canada, for example, people having business in Canada, there's strategies to have mobility of professions, mobility of business. And so unique provincial legislation causes a barrier for this and causes intermobility issues. So what's happened since 2010? So 2010 was when this change was taken into a state of royal assent by being passed in the Ontario legislature. But what's happened then? We're talking about it today because obviously it's a current issue. So there's been a couple of things. In the last month, we've seen 2 deaths in Ontario in the manufacturing sector in relation to equipment and machinery. We've also seen in the last 3 years over 30 prosecutions in the sector related to equipment and machinery work. We also had a state where the implementation date of when this will actually happen, the proclamation date, is one that originally was March the 1st. It's September the 1st. It's not clear how that's going to progress. So this is setting up the framework now for our special guest from OPG to speak about implementation and what's the perspective from the industry side. So I'll let Fred come up and take it from here.